Greetings and welcome back to room 303 at our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to one of the last of the songs in what we have called the Psalms, or the song section of Leaves of Grass. Song for occupations. Now, this one is a fascinating study for so many reasons. It is the great poem of labor, so let's just put that in our notes now right away. Here we will hear a line like, heroic celebration of labor as life, work as art, end quote. Now let's begin with a few assumptions that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net and the previous lectures down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. Let's not forget that our learning theory is constantly trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Now this will be significant because this is one of the original poems of the 55 edition, and yet here it will end up in the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass far later, and so we'll begin to try to connect it to some of the stuff that we have seen already in Leaves of Grass. That is to say, as we have said, the new is the new, the NEW is the KNEW. Of course, our annotative approach is to ask at 3 levels of study reading about what we're about to see here. At level 1, we're going to summarize. At level 2A, themes and messages. At level 2B, rhetoric, not what Whitman says, but how Whitman says it. For example, we're going to see a lot of repetition, a lot of cataloging, very similar to so much of what we've seen in Leaves of Grass already. At level 3A, we're going to ask, how can I relate this to other information that I know? We're going to talk about Marx. We're going to talk about Upton Sinclair. That time in American thought and world thought when the laborer was starting to be thought of again as crucial, as important, and here we'll see it for sure. And then finally, and most importantly, because of our learning theory, we're going to ask, how can I relate this information to myself? For example, as I've said to you guys already, Whitman, I won't say he invents this game for us in 303, but he certainly is going to applaud us when we play the game of who made that, or who made this. So for whatever it is you're doing, wherever you're sitting right now, whether it's in 303 or elsewhere, which is probably 303 extended, just start looking around where you're sitting and ask the simple question, who made that? For example, the glasses that I have in front of me have these little tiny mechanisms, little screws and stuff. Well, who made that? Well, of course, today we live in an age of technology where we might even be able to say, well, a machine made that. Well, who made the machine? See, so in other words, every time we play the who made that game, it is inevitably going to take us back to a human, a laborer. Somebody built all of this stuff that's sitting around us. And Whitman doesn't want us to take that just for granted. This is kind of Jordan Peterson's argument for we mustn't take civilization for granted. It is a very fragile kind of construction, and it can be deconstructed very quickly. One of the ways to remember that is just simply to ask the chair that you're sitting on, who made it, and all the components of that chair. And where did all those components come from? Humans had to somehow put all that together. So we're going to play that game for sure as we relate. Now, of course, our big 5, just to remind, we're going to ask about epistemology, that is to say what we can know, ontology, who we are. We're going to see a lot of that in this poem. Psychology and sociology, the study of the individual mind and the collective mind, going to be really important here, especially the sociological readings. And then finally, the question of theodicy. Why is it that bad things have to happen? And we're going to see that for sure in this poem as well. Now, the 5 P's, or perspectives, on Whitman, as we've spoken about it in many of our earlier discussions, is to see Whitman, and this isn't exclusive. I mean, as we have said, we're going to miss, obviously, a few more of these potential P's. Whitman is person, no question. We're going to be very interested in the fact that Whitman didn't start out to be a poet, as we've said. He started out as a carpenter, as a builder. That is to say, when he talks in this poem about people who build things, he understands that at an intuitive level. He watched his own father, as we've said in previous lectures. Obviously, we see Whitman as poet and his celebration of the laborer, and we're going to see the celebration of democracy in America as extension. Whitman as pedagogue. We're going to hear something about scholars and teachers in this poem, and I think, as I've said to you guys many times, Whitman started out as a teacher. He never left that first love, and I think he wrote Leaves of Grass as a teacher, and so there we'll see some of that. Whitman as politician in his celebration of democracy, no question. As we said in our previous poem, Redwood, here he's going to continue to celebrate America as being built from the ground up in many ways. And then finally, and very importantly for this poem, Whitman as philosopher. That is to say, from Socrates to Emerson and everybody in between, he's going to be playing certain kinds of philosophic games. Now, as we have said, I recommend that you have your own copy of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, that you do your own reading and annotation, and then come to what we have to say here as secondary, or some combination of it. Now, as we often do, we'll begin with our Nortons, who will give us some background information. Nortons will tell us about A Song for Occupations. This was the second of the 12 untitled poems of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. It was subsequently called Poem of the Daily Work of the Workmen and Workwomen of these States in 1856, number 3 of the Chants Democratic in 1860, To Working Men in 1867, and Carol of Occupations in 71 and 76. In 1881, it received its present title. Walt Whitman worked at it persistently. I think that's important for our reading and study of this poem, regarding it as a major pronouncement. In the manuscript revisions of his 1860 text, he suggested such titles as Song of Trades and Implements or Chant of Mechanics. And although he wrote on the title page, "This is satisfactory as it is now, December 7, 1864, he marked for deletion much of what is now the 5th section, we'll call it the catalog section, and labeled the final section Out Without Fail. Section 5 contained 65 lines in 55 in 1855, was expanded to 80 lines in 1860, and finally reduced to its present 38. The 178 lines of the original poem became 196 in 1856, 205 in 1860, 158 in 1871 and 1876, and finally the 151. The general effect was to shorten the catalogs and diminish the sense of intimacy. For example, the opening passage, dropped in 1881, began, and this is fascinating that this is how this poem began, "Come closer to me, push close my lovers, and take the best I possess. Yield closer and give me the best you possess." Finally, Norton suggests that we should compare lines 1309, 1313 of Song of Myself with lines 44 to 48 of this song for examples of the consistency and spirit of the first Leaves. And I would argue that that is a good activity. Now, this is a 6-part poem that we're going to go ahead and just treat as one collective poem. I think it reads that way. It makes our lecture a little bit longer, and we break our lectures up into these 20-minute recordings because of our technology, but I think it makes sense for us to go ahead and just look at this all the way through. Now, again, this is going to be Whitman's celebration of the laborer, but I think as well he's going to be lamenting in some way what has been lost by citizen. Maybe we would argue a loss of wholeness and a sense of wholeness. And as we get into this, we'll kind of play that game. And the way in which he speaks directly to the laborer as he begins his poem. We'll start in passage 1. A song for occupations. By the way, notice all the exclamation points. In the labor of engines and trades, in the labor of fields, I find the developments and find the eternal meanings. Now, you could make the argument that already we're meeting Whitman's theodicy, the meanings of all that's happening, especially the pain. Notice he says the developments is going to take us immediately to this notion of evolution, and this word eternal, the very first use. He loves this word, right? As I pondered in silence, the eternal soul, and he's been using this the whole time. So in other words, from the very beginning, he says, I'm looking for the real meanings of what labor is all about. Workmen and workwomen, by the way, notice, to speak in the language of equality. Notice, we're going to get workmen, but we're also going to get workwomen with the exclamation point. And then we're going to get several of these words. Now, we're going to see this anaphoria, or this repetition of first words at lines. We're obviously very familiar with it now as we're reading in Leaves of Grass from the very beginning. Were all educations practical and ornamental, well displayed out of me, what would it amount to? Notice these rhetorical questions. Were I, as the head teacher, charitable proprietor, wise statesman, what would it amount to? Were I to you, as the boss, employing and paying you, would that satisfy you? Now, I think these are interesting questions for us to begin with. He asks the question of value right from the beginning. Were all educations practical and ornamental, well displayed out of me? What would it amount to? In other words, he's going to argue for the notion that the greatest value is you, the laborer, and obviously by extension, the reader. I find it fascinating that Whitman and Ginsberg and others have made a whole bunch of this in their talking and thinking about this. Whitman was this poet who genuinely believed that somebody going, for example, to work on a skyscraper in downtown Manhattan would carry in his lunch pail or in his back pocket a copy of Leaves of Grass. Whitman really believed this. He believed that he was writing to what he would consider the authentic or the true American, that is to say, people who built things. And then he wanted this poem to celebrate that. In some ways, we saw this already in Song of the Exposition, didn't we, right? Were I to you as the boss employing and paying you, would that satisfy you? In other words, it's almost as if he is saying, I want to be your greatest song master. I want to sing for you. The learned, we obviously think of the learned astronomer later coming in Leaves of Grass. The learned, virtuous, benevolent, in the usual terms, a man like me, and never the usual terms. In other words, from the very beginning of this poem, Whitman is going to say, I want to be different. I want to be a different kind of poet. I want to celebrate differently, so let's go to work. Then we're going to get 4 times his use of the word I to make this poem very intimate. Neither a servant nor a master I. Now, of course, note the strange syntax which takes us back to Hamlet and to Polonius's suggestion to Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be. We today don't read the play Hamlet or any number of Shakespeare plays the way that Whitman's audience would have. So this strange syntax is an echoing that will take us back there. He says, I take no sooner a large price than a small price. I will have my own whoever enjoys me. And it's fascinating. When he's talking about me here, he's talking about Leaves of Grass, right? I will be even with you. We've seen this already in Leaves of Grass. And you shall be even with me, this inclusivity, this sense of kind of a fraternity or a brotherhood and sisterhood that he wants to create with his readers. And then now notice 7 times we'll get this word if. And it's all kind of rhetorical, the game that he's playing. If you stand at work in a shop, I stand as nigh as the nighest in the same shop. Now, in other words, what he's saying is identification. And this is this idea. And it's a very old one. It's a very ancient one, as we've said in earlier lectures at LearnStrong.net. Of course, Dante comes to mind. Certainly Milton and Chaucer come to mind. This idea, I am with you. In other words, there is no real distinction, Whitman will say, between me and you. I am celebrating myself, and in so doing, celebrate you, is the way he would say it at the beginning lines, of course, of Song of Myself. If you bestow gifts on your brother or dearest friend, I demand as good as your brother or dearest friend. If your lover, it's always a controversial word when he uses it, husband, wife, is welcomed by day or night, I must be personally as welcome. If you become degraded, notice, as we said in our study of Song of the Open Road and in our other poems, Whitman sees both sides. This is why we just don't call him the eternal optimist. He is what I call an informed optimist. Whitman knows of the pain and the suffering of existence, and so here he'll reference it. If you become degraded, criminal, ill, that I become so for your sake. Now, this for your sake is obviously biblical language, both Christ's language as well as Pauline theology as well. If you remember your foolish and outlawed deeds, do you think I cannot remember my own foolish and outlawed deeds? Now, as the great critiquer of Whitman, Harold Bloom, says, Whitman is always promising us that he's going to let us know the real Whitman. And of course, he never ever gets around to telling us. Like, for example, what are these foolish and outlawed deeds that you're talking about? Well, exactly. And yet, here it is. He's saying, I know that humankind has both the positive, the light, and the negative, the dark. And I want to embrace all of those. If you carouse at the table, the only other uses in Song of Joys with this use of the word carouse, at the table, I carouse at the opposite side of the table. And obviously, carousal here can mean, especially in Whitman's day, something sexual, which leads us to the next set of lines. If you meet some stranger in the streets and love him or her, why, I often meet strangers in the streets and love them. You'll remember to a stranger, let's just go back to that for a second, because these echoes, I love to point them out, and I'm working to not do too much of this, but can I at least play this game to you, to a stranger? Opening lines, passing stranger, you do not know how lovingly I look upon you. You must be he I was seeking, or she I was seeking. It comes to me as of a dream. I have somewhere surely lived a life of joy with you. All is recalled as we flit by each other, fluid, affectionate, chaste, matured. You grew up with me. And of course, we have given full lectures on everything that's preceded in Leaves of Grass up to this point, and you can go back to learnstrong.net and find the Talks with Walt list to see what we had to say there. If you meet some stranger in the streets and love him or her, why, I often meet strangers in the street and love them. And then a series of fascinating rhetorical questions. Why? And this word why tells us, and I think he learned this from Chaucer, like, for example, go back to what we have to say about the Pardoner's prologue, where he uses the word what, Chaucer uses the word what, and of course it's the Pardoner who's speaking, and you can get the sense that the dramatic context is somebody's interrupting him as he goes, wait, what do you think? Here it's why. In other words, what he has just said is radical, and he knows this. He knows that there will be some people who would maybe, if he was reading it in front of them or sharing these ideas in front of them, they would be like, wait a minute, what do you mean you love anybody, even a stranger that you've met on the street? And he says, why? What have you thought of yourself? The ontological question, right? I told you in our Big Five, this is going to be a big one. What have you thought of yourself? This is, of course, the Delphi Oracle, take it back, know thyself, and all of that. What have you thought of yourself, he asks. Is it you, then, that thought yourself less? Is it you that thought the president greater than you? Or the rich better off than you? Or the educated wiser than you? Now, these are fascinating rhetorical questions. By the way, notice just the irony of the fact that in 1855, when he writes this, and then later by 1881, when he uses the word president, remember, in 1881 alone, you could be talking about 3 presidents, right? We can talk about Hayes, Garfield, or Arthur, just depending on which president. But what's the point here? Well, I think he's asking, what do you really think of yourself as somebody who is just nothing more than, can I use air quotes, a laborer, a worker? And to that degree, do you actually think of yourself as lesser than the most important people that we often place there in precedence? The president, we're going to come back to this, or the rich, or the educated. In other words, it is a compelling idea that Whitman will say, true democracy sees all of us as necessary and therefore equal, and of great value, not less value, great value. And then the parenthetics, which we've seen many times already in Leaves of Grass. Because, notice, he'll go right to the heart of the matter, and he's speaking directly to a certain constituency of readers who maybe think of themselves as lesser. Because you are greasy, only used, by the way, in all Leaves of Grass, or pimpled, or were once drunk, or a thief, or that you were diseased, or rheumatic, or a prostitute, or from frivolity or impotence, or that you are no scholar and never saw your name in print, do you give in that you are any less immortal? And then the parenthetic again. This is almost like an aside. And notice what is he saying. By the way, this pimpled and prostitute takes us back to Song of Myself, passage 15. I'll just play this one game with you because I love the echoes. And I've said to you that I think T.S. Eliot learned to play this game through his study of Walt Whitman. You'll maybe remember as we're talking about this idea of the prostitute and the pimples and all of that, and some of you are saying there's an echo that's being played here, and I'm scanning it in my volume to see it. Do you remember this one? The prostitute draggles her shawl, her bonnet bobs on her tipsy and pimpled neck. The crowd laughed at her blackguard oaths. The men jeer and wink to each other. And then he says it in parenthetics, miserable. I do not laugh at your oaths, nor jeer you. And then he comes back to the president holding a cabinet. So I think there's these echoes that you're hearing here. In other words, he says, there is no one who is lesser than in Whitman's America. We're all of great equal value. By the way, from frivolity or impotence, only use in all of Leaves of Grass. And some readers have seen that maybe Whitman himself struggled with sexual impotence, which is what led to some of his sexual consternations. All of this is these self-reflective woes that could lead to a certain kind of theodictic question of, what is the point? How valuable could I possibly be? And then we immediately move into passage 2 with the word souls. Souls of men and women, exclamation point. In other words, you are far more than your body. You are far more than your mind. You are a soul. And that for Whitman will be significant. Notice he says, it is not you I call unseen, unheard, untouchable. We think of Gandhi, of course, in his reaction to the untouchables of India. And untouching, notice the 4 uns here. It is not you I go argue pro and con about and to settle whether you are alive or no. I own publicly who you are if nobody else owns. And this is, of course, the if nobody else owns is what makes Whitman America's poet, right? From the beginning, Whitman wanted to be inclusive in his, and I think this is why we reread Leaves of Grass today. I mean, people keep asking me, why don't you comment more about what's going on in public life? And to which I will often respond, in political life, and I will often respond, I think reading Whitman is the answer to a whole lot of the social ills in America and the world. Because here, Whitman is reminding us, we're all in this together. And there is no lesser than and greater than. We're all in this together because, of course, we are all souls for Whitman. Grown, half-grown, and babe of this country and every country. Notice his inclusivity of the world. We'll get to more of this with passage to India. Indoors and out of doors, one just as much as the other. I see, and notice we're going to get this I see several times now in this passage. And all else behind or through them. The wife, and she is not one jot less than the husband. This is some radical stuff. Think about this, because 18th of August, 1920 is the 19th Amendment, when finally women are given certain ideas of equality. But here, already we're getting something like this. The wife, and she is not one jot less than the husband. The daughter, and she is just as good as the son. The mother, and she is every bit as much as the father. Today, we kind of read this and ho-hum this. But when this thing's published for the very first time, you have, in 1855, you have a lot of people who read this and say, how dare you say that a daughter is equal to a son, or that a wife is equal to a husband? Offspring of ignorant and poor, boys apprenticed to trades, young fellows working on farms and old fellows working on farms. We've seen this before, right? Sailormen, merchantmen, coasters, immigrants were already